Welcome back to just another task analysis. We're going to jump right in. We're on page 28, chapter 2, and we're going to start talking about respondent behavior. So the first key term is a reflex, and a reflex is an immediate response that has not been taught. So these are things that we are all born with and automatically do. So think about a toddler that's walking around and can finally reach the stove and they put their hand on their stove. Nobody is telling them to immediately remove their hand from that pain, right? So the senses are getting burnt. It hurts, it's painful, and they immediate reaction to remove their hand. That's something that we're all born with. Stimulus is presented and the response is immediate, and this little chain of events is called respondent behavior, where you only need the stimulus. In this case, we're going to say somebody splashing water in your face, and your immediate reaction is to jerk back or close your eyes. Everyone's going to have the same reaction regardless of whether it's a 6-month-old, a 5-year-old, a 15-year-old, or a 50-year-old. Now, if you're a lifeguard, right, in the summer, and you're used to getting splashed in the face, yes, of course, your reaction is going to be like this. But the more times that lifeguard is exposed to this stimulus, the less intense the response will be. And sometimes there will be barely any response at all, so they might just kind of stand there while they're getting splashed repeatedly in the face. This is called habituation. And you'll get really comfortable with this term in your everyday life if you are working with somebody who's engaging in repetitive behavior. So if you have somebody who's coming up to you who's constantly yelling, after a while you learn to tune that out. It's not going to be as aversive as, for example, the first 3 or 4 days of session when you were like, oh my gosh, I cannot, right? And something else would be like biting or scratching. If you get bit or scratched long enough, after a while, you don't even respond. Like, you're just kind of like, that is habituation. So you will definitely see this in the field throughout your career. Now we're going to move on into the fun stuff. Responding conditioning, or classical conditioning, or Pavlovian conditioning, is when you take a previously neutral stimuli. That means something in the environment that does not affect the organism or you in any way, shape, or form, and you pair it with something that does elicit a response from you. So here they go and talk about the experiment that Pavlov worked on with the dogs, where he noticed that the dogs started drooling when the technician would open the door to their cage. There was no food present, but he made this observation, and so he started to think about how he could control to prove that this unconditioned stimuli, which was the technicians opening the door, was actually making the dogs drool. So he took a second unconditioned stimulus, a metronome sound, and he started playing the metronome sound right before the dogs were being fed. So after consistent pairings of these two stimuli, which is stimulus pairing, he found that he could get the dogs to drool just by hearing the metronome. So there was no food present at this point, but they had been exposed to the food so quickly after they were exposed to the metronome that the metronome in itself was causing them to engage in this reflex. So it was no longer unconditioned reflex because this was learned, so it was now a conditioned response. So let's break it down because that's a lot of key terms for one page. We have our unconditioned unlearned reflex of drooling in response to our stimulus of food. So the dogs see, smell, or taste food and they immediately start to drool. Okay, that is not learned. Now we're going to take a neutral stimulus. Neutral stimulus is something that does not affect the organism in any way, shape, or form. In this case, it was a metronome. So the neutral stimulus of the metronome is presented immediately with the food or right before the food, and that is called pairing. Stimulus, stimulus, pairing. Okay? Now, the stimulus-stimulus pairing, after it has been presented consistently for multiple times, will then create a conditioned response and a conditioned stimulus. So now our metronome, which used to be neutral, has now been a conditioned stimuli because the dogs have learned that when they hear this sound, food is immediately or at the same time presented with this sound. So now, if they hear the metronome, they will drool, even if there is no food. And that is a conditioned reflex. Yeah. Since ABA is a science, of course, now we want to find out, but wait, what happens if we keep on presenting the metronome over and over without presenting the food, aka the unconditioned stimulus? Well, respondent extinction occurs, which means that every single time food is not presented, the strength of the conditioned stimulus decreases. So after a while, the dogs will no longer drool because they are not getting that food, the unconditioned stimulus, anymore. Okay? So let's take it to the next level. What happens if we pair a second unconditioned stimulus to the first conditioned stimulus? So we are doing now a stimulus pairing, but we are doing the conditioned stimulus of the metronome to singing. Stay with me, right? So the metronome has now become a conditioned stimulus, and we're going to pair a second neutral stimulus, the singing. The person who is pouring the food into the bowls or mixing the food sings the same song every single day. So when the dogs hear the singing, that is now higher order conditioning or second conditioning. There you have it, Cooper in more bite-sized manageable pieces. So I know it was a lot in this video to unpack, so the best way for you to understand this is to apply what we just went over in your everyday life. Come up with some unconditioned stimulus, neutral stimulus, conditioned stimulus. You know, all of these key terms, they can be applied in your everyday life. Or if you don't want to observe yourself, observe your significant other, your friends, your kids, your neighbors, and come up with these examples that make sense to you so that when you sit for the exam, you'll know immediately which key term they're talking about and if it applies to the question or not. Keep up that studying. See you later.